There's really never been a president of the United States like the current Oval Office occupant. Depending on where you sit, it's been somewhere between shocking and unprecedented, appalling and horrendous, or lots of fun because he's shaking things up. David Frum is a longtime analyst of the American political landscape in general and conservative politics in particular. His new book is a must-read for anyone trying to make sense of what's going on with our neighbor to the south. It's called Trumpocracy: The Corruption of the American Republic. And we're pleased that it brings David Frum back to our studio tonight. So good to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for making time for us. David, America has had controversial presidents. It has had crazy presidents. It has had bad presidents. It has had disgraceful presidents. In which case, how is Donald Trump so unique?
Donald Trump is unique because he is the first and only president who has set himself to attack the institutions of the United States government, from the FBI, the independence of the Department of Justice, prevailing ethical standards, even such expectations as the president should act as the comforter-in-chief and chief mourner of the country. He is a president who was elected in part because he not only ignored, but actively attacked all of those obligations of all of his predecessors. And that's exactly what he has done in office.
If I had said to you a year ago, he's going to get somebody put on the Supreme Court, he's going to be the president as Islamic State is nearly defeated, he's going to repeal the Obamacare individual mandate, there will be major tax reform on his watch. There will be a major rollback of a lot of regulations you probably don't like, from Arctic drilling to net neutrality. There will be an announcement that the American embassy in Israel is going to be relocated to Jerusalem. My hunch is, if his name were not attached to that record of achievement, you'd be pretty okay with all of that.
Some yes, some no. And much of it happened without reference to him. So the defeat of the Islamic State's territorial existence, that was a plan that was well underway but before Donald Trump became president. The military has continued to execute the plan. The hard part of that plan comes next, because once the United States military is very good at defeating an opponent who tries to hold ground. An opponent who makes that mistake, as Saddam Hussein discovered, gets rolled up pretty fast with pretty minimal casualties to the United States side. Then comes the next phase. Now the United States has to restore order and reconstruct. Now it has to deal with a dematerialized ISIS. That will be harder, and that will take new ideas, not leftover ideas from the previous administration. The appointment of Neil Gorsuch, I do welcome, as you say. I'm pretty happy with the corporate side of the tax reform. All of those are works of the Republican Congress. The big surprise in Donald Trump's presidency is he campaigned against the Republican Congress. He said, I'm going to be a different kind of, I'm not going to do big tax cuts for the rich. I'm going to be about preserving health care benefits. I am going to be focused on the middle class. And that is the part that went out the window. By the way, one of the reasons he was the Republican nominee is he was the only person on that stage in all of those debates, of 17 men and women, to speak so often and so eloquently about this terrible opioid crisis that has done so much harm. And yet, as president, he's ignored it. He didn't even get around to appointing a head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And his now de facto head is a 24-year-old Trump campaign worker with a falsified resume who was fired from his one and only previous job for not showing up.
You say all that like it's a negative thing. Okay,
well, I don't want to seem judgmental about millennials. They have their own distinctive work style.
I get you. And in fact, the other thing he did promise was a $1 trillion infrastructure program, but we haven't seen many details of that yet either.
We haven't seen many details of that.
Okay. Having said that, you know I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Apple just announced the other day that thanks to tax reform, they're going to do $30 billion of business in the United States over the next 5 years. They're going to create 20,000 new jobs. They're going to repatriate billions upon billions of dollars that they were hiding overseas and declining to bring home under the higher tax rates. Yeah. That's all good, isn't it?
That's meaningless. I'm sorry. This is. I'm actually very sorry to see Apple, a company I admire and of which I'm a customer, flim-flamming so many people that these things are meaningless. Apple didn't say they were going to hire 20,000 people. When Apple says 20,000 jobs will be created, they're referring to all the jobs by app developers, by everyone who in any way supplies them. That's not a very big number. As for this idea that when you repatriate money, you're making any real, where do you think that money is now? That money is held by Apple subsidiaries in New York banks, and it's available right now for any purpose that Apple cares to make. And if Apple wants to make an investment, if for tax reasons they don't want to move the money from one account to another, they can borrow against it. Nothing real will happen as a result of that repatriation.
So that's more PR than anything.
That's total PR, and it's really shameful that Apple is doing it, and I'm sorry to say that some journalists who don't understand corporate accounting, and maybe that's not a skill you have to have, but are not
95% of them.
That's not understanding how little has just occurred.
Okay. As you look back at President Trump's first year, what was the worst moment for you?
Oh my gosh, in the first year. One of the most upsetting moments was his tirade at the Boy Scouts Jamboree. The president is ex officio president of the Boy Scouts of America. There's a jamboree every 4 years. The president is always invited to speak. Most presidents say no because they don't want to bring a political content. And Donald Trump went on a rampage, a self-aggrandizing rampage. I mean, there's so many of those. I think, he just is pervasively cruel and unpleasant. And the endless official lying and the attacks on the media, it would be hard to single out one thing. But here's something that I think doesn't get enough attention, that is just sort of reflective of what's going on and why he's dangerous. Donald Trump is carrying on a business while president. He's supposedly divested himself, but his sons are the nominal chief operating officers. By their own admission, they report to him all the time, not only on gross figures, but on the nitty-gritty of the business. He receives all the money, and he can resume control at any time that he wants under the instrument he signs. So it's not a divestment at all. One of the largest sources of revenue to that business are payments from his international partners, to whom he's licensed his name, in India, in the Philippines, in Turkey. The President of the United States is receiving millions of dollars, nobody knows how much, in transfers from foreign business partners. And those business partners, in turn, are susceptible to pressure from their governments. When you may remember that the Prime Minister of Turkey, Recep Erdogan, came to Washington, he had a group of bodyguards. They beat up some protesters right there in front of the Turkish embassy on Massachusetts Avenue. The United States never protested, never did anything about it. Donald Trump shortly afterwards had a friendly conversation with this thug Turkish leader. When the Turkish coup happened and Erdogan cracked down on vast sections of Turkish society, one of the people he picked up was Donald Trump's business partner in Istanbul. And he held him for a few days, and then he let him go. And he had a new and improved attitudes afterwards. And that attitude may be communicating itself to the president, that Donald Trump's livelihood is in the grip of the leader of Turkey. His business partner in the Philippines is the present Filipino ambassador to the United States. When the Filipino ambassador to the United States talks to the president, he's not talking like the ambassador from a smaller country to a greater country. He's talking like the guy who signs Donald Trump's paycheck.
You have a quite fascinating chapter in here about how the White House is, in some respects, ground zero of a corporate kleptocracy.
Yes.
Has there not been anything like this before?
There has never been anything like this before. Never. And the scale of it, the brazenness of it, and the complicity of Congress, even in the days when the United States has had a constant problem with political corruption, more than Germany or Britain or Canada. But even in the days when the corruption was more blatant than now, the office of the presidency was in some ways separated from all of this. And certainly it wasn't the leader. The money is what drives Trump's authoritarianism, because he's doing so many things that are improper that he's in constant risk of tripping some legal mechanism. And so he has to turn off the FBI and the Department of Justice and ethical standards in self-protection.
Here is a quip from Kevin Williamson, whom I'm sure you know from the National Review. Donald Trump runs a Twitter account. President John Kelly is running the administration. This is obviously a quip, but there's a more serious side to this, which is, do you think that the President's Chief of Staff, John Kelly, his Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, do they enable the President's craziness, or are they protecting us from it?
At any given moment, those reasonably responsible people may be doing protective work. But the idea, there's this idea out there that if the president says something crazy, that he can be countermanded by his subordinate officials. It's not true. In the end, the president has the power to hire and to fire. Rex Tillerson is on the way out. Rex Tillerson, by the way, has done a lot of damage as Secretary of State. He's not staffed the agency properly. He has remodeled it without understanding how it works. I think a lot of this seems to be a leftover from his time at ExxonMobil, when ExxonMobil bumps into the Department of State all the time in unpleasant ways, because the United States has laws against bribing foreign officials. There's a lot of bribery in the oil business. It's a competitive disadvantage to ExxonMobil that it can't bribe when some of its foreign competitors can.
Doesn't he swear he's never done that, though?
He may well have never done it, but he doesn't like the people who enforce the rules, or he may not. I don't want to make this as a fact statement. But what he has done to the Department of State is really destructive. Right now, there's no U.S. ambassador in South Korea. Right now, there's no U.S. ambassador in Germany. In the middle of these ferocious Brexit negotiations between Britain and the EU, there's no U.S. ambassador to the European Union, for once a very important job. And John Kelly, yes, he's managing the president as best he can. But one of the things we've learned is you can't manage Donald Trump. And at the risk of giving you too long an answer, let me tell a story from the book that illustrates this. H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, who replaced Michael Flynn, who was an undeclared agent of the Turkish government.
Who was there for how many days?
He was there for about a month, and was ultimately brought down by revelations that he had lied about the nature of his contacts with the Russian ambassador. H.R. McMaster is one of the most distinguished American soldiers of his generation, a hero in Iraq and Afghanistan, the author of an important book, but civil-military relationships, just a generally admired man. When he came to office, one of the first things he decided to do was to set right the confusion over whether Donald Trump supports NATO or not. He arranged for Donald Trump to go to a NATO summit in April of 2017. He arranged for him to give a speech at NATO headquarters. He would stand at the monument to Article 5, the treaty, the component of the treaty that commits one member to defend the others.
All for one and one for all?
Exactly. A twisted girder from the World Trade Center. It's there in Brussels. Trump would stand in front of it and declare the United States is committed to Article 5. And just to be sure that the president said the right thing, McMaster wrote the relevant paragraph himself.
Except that
on the plane over, he briefed journalists on what the president was going to say. Trump got to the passage in the speech, and whether it was because he doesn't like to be told what to do, or whether he had an ideological commitment, or whether someone in Moscow has a thumb on his artery, for whatever reason, he didn't read the line. Afterwards, and this is when you go to raises the question, these people can protect us. The journalist naturally asked McMaster, you told us on the plane over the president was going to say this. What happened? And McMaster had to answer, I don't know what you're talking about. Everything is fine. So he was forced to compromise and betray himself in order to cover the actions of the president.
I thought, actually, just circling back, that when I asked you about the worst moment in the first year, apropos of what you just said, I thought you might say that moment where the cameras were brought into a cabinet meeting, and almost as if we were in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, each one by one, except for Jim Mattis, had to say what a glory and an honor it is to serve in your administration, Mr. President. Did you vomit when you watched that?
I didn't much like that. I remembered, I worked for President Bush. 43. I remember when people talked in any way like that to him, the interior eye roll that would happen, and then as soon as the door was closed, they kind of... And he didn't like that at all. He saw right through it, as most people in politics do, but Donald Trump did not. Observation about Jim Mattis. So Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, has been probably the most formidable of Trump's internal checks, and he's made no secret of his own views. There's a clip of him that surfaced on YouTube of him speaking to troops in Jordan. And he gave what maybe one of the great oppositional speeches of the Trump era, in which he said to the troops, as you all know, our country isn't now where it should be. We need to get back to a place where we are more respectful of each other, kinder to each other, irrespective of our differences. And all I'm asking of you, my fine young soldiers, airmen, and Marines, is until that day that you hold the line for our country. So that doesn't get more explicit. But the thing to understand about this is, okay, so obviously it would be better if Jim Mattis were president. It would be a lot better if Jim Mattis were president. But the fact that the military is slipping civilian control, even if you like the leaders of the military more and respect them more and think they're more patriotic and kinder than the president, it's still a giant problem when you say the solution to Trumpocracy is for the Secretary of Defense to defy and ignore the president.
Having said all this, the last CNN survey I saw has got Trump Around 35 or 40%. In other words, holding firm with his base. Notwithstanding everything you have written, notwithstanding all of the shenanigans and all of the disgraceful conduct and the lying and et cetera, they have held firm with him.
Yes.
How come?
Well, let me say, I'm going to make a prediction that his numbers will be better in 2018 than they have been in 2017. The economy, American economy, is strong. It is it's been recovering from the crisis of the Great Recession since the summer of 2010, but only now is the recovery showing up in the form of higher wages and a lot more hiring. The Trump tax cut, which has many unfairnesses to it, but will put more money in the pockets of many people, especially Trump-type voters. The big winners, well, the big winners under the tax plan are the very wealthy. The big losers are upper-income married professionals in high-tax blue states. But also winners are families in red states with low taxes who have a lot of kids. And then they don't feel the Trump tax increases. They get the benefit of the Trump tax cuts. They'll have $1,000 or $2,000 extra dollars a year of spending money. They'll like that at a time when wages are rising anyway. So I think his numbers are, I think one of the stories of 2018 may be the Trump political comeback. And in this recent shutdown, the Democrats really bungled their performance for reasons that we can talk about why that is. But they had reasons for it, but they mishandled it in a way that I think portends trouble ahead for them in their political work in 2018. No one should assume that this presidency is collapsing of its own weight.
Is there anything he could do? I mean, he's sort of already boasted about the fact he could go down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and his support would still stay in place. Yeah. What would it take for Trump's support base to fail on him?
Well, you don't get into political trouble when your base deserts you. In 1932, at the depths of the Great Depression, with Americans literally going hungry, Herbert Hoover still got 38% of the vote against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And there were large parts of America where people said, well, I don't like his handling of the Depression very much, but at least he's keeping liquor illegal. That's something. The way you lose is when you lose the soft supporters, not the hard supporters. And through 2017, Donald Trump did shed many of those more traditional Republicans. I give an example in the book of how this works. I compare two races that took place in 2016 in the state of Pennsylvania. There were two statewide races, Donald Trump running for president and a man named Pat Toomey who was running for re-election as U.S. Senator. Both Trump and Toomey got almost exactly the same number of votes, but they got them in very different places. Toomey ran hundreds of thousands of votes ahead of Trump in the well-to-do suburbs of Philadelphia, and hundreds of thousands of votes behind Trump in the more hard-scrabble middle of the state, the former industrial and mining regions. So what happened to Trump in 2017 is those soft Trump supporters, Toomey Republicans, Romney Republicans, they drifted away, especially the women, because of his behavior, because of his embarrassment, because of the Russia matter. In 2018, they may come, at least many of them, back as the economy improves with the tax cut and as the Democrats are pulled to their left by the Democrats who want to run for president in 2020. The Democratic strategy, the right strategy for 2018 is a more centrist one, but the way to win the Democratic nomination is by talking about amnesty for illegal aliens, for a big single-payer health care. Everyone will be competing for the leftover Bernie Sanders voters, and that is pulling the Democratic Party to places where it will be less competitive.
Which suggests he could win again.
Of course he could. Put it this way, he's one of the two, he's the incumbent president of the United States. Incumbents usually win. It takes a lot for an incumbent to lose. Herbert Hoover was an incumbent who lost. Jimmy Carter was an incumbent who lost. George H.W. Bush was an incumbent who lost. And they were presidents during recessions. And even George W. Bush was an incumbent president in 2004 during an unsuccessful war. And he still won. He won with the smallest margin of any president not actually to lose, but he still won.
You mentioned Russia in the midst of that last answer, and I do want to pick up on that. Is there any doubt in your mind that the Trump campaign during the last national election in the United States somehow colluded with Russian entities to help his candidacy?
I don't think there's any doubt that there was some kind of cooperation. Well, let's start with what we know. We know that Russia actively worked to elect Donald Trump. We know that this was a very substantial effort. We know that they communicated with the Trump campaign. There was a meeting, and it's recorded in emails. We know that they offered derogatory information about Hillary Clinton, and that the offer was accepted, although the Trump people didn't like the information that they were offered. We can observe, we don't know this is a fact, but we can observe, and I chronicle in the book, the subtle paralleling of the work of WikiLeaks and the Trump campaign. And the Trump people do seem to have had advance notice when WikiLeaks dumps were coming, and I offer the evidence for that in the book. The big outstanding question is, how much information did the Trump people send back to Russia? Did they tell them, you know those Facebook ads you're running? More people saw a Russian Facebook ad in 2016 than cast a ballot. It would be most helpful to us if you ran them in the following places. Did the Russians figure that out on their own, or were they helped? We don't know the answer to that question. But here's now the moral and national security challenge for the American state. It is illegal to hack communications or to directly receive the hack from a hacker if you're not a news organization. So if the Trump people received a hack directly from the Russians, that's a crime. It is a crime to receive anything of value for a campaign to receive anything of value from a foreign entity. It's not clear whether information counts as something of value, but you could argue that it does, and that would be a crime if they received it directly. But the actual act of collusion, when the Trump people go on Fox News and say it's not a crime to collude, they're not wrong. I mean, it's disgraceful, it's unpatriotic, it's un-American, it's
impeachable.
At the convention in 1787, we know a little bit about what was discussed because James Madison took notes. They talked about impeachment a couple of times. And the number one example they cited of what was an impeachable event was the record of Charles II, who was King of England a century before, who had taken bribes from the French king in return for letting the French take over English territory on the mainland of Europe, the city of Dunkirk. That was twice brought up as the classic example of what you would impeach a president for. So yeah, I think that's what impeachment is for. But America's now a much more legalistic country, and Trump defenders will say, as this comes more and more into view, they didn't receive the hack directly. They received it through WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, you can say, is a media organization. Yes, they received information, but information is not a thing of value. If the Russians had brought them a truckload of donuts to give away for free at their rallies, that would be a thing of value, but information is not a thing of value. And the collusion is not a crime. So what's the problem? He didn't break the law, therefore he should be able to remain in office. This is an argument that is coming.
Gotcha. Here's, I'm going to skip ahead here, okay? We're, Sheldon, page 4, chapter 5 here. Here's from Trumpocracy. David, you wrote this. As president, Trump is cruel, vengeful, egotistic, ignorant, lazy, avaricious, and treacherous. So we must be kind, forgiving, responsible, informed, hardworking, generous, and patriotic. As Trump's enablers are careless, cynical, short-sighted, morally obtuse, and rancorous, so Trump's opponents must be thoughtful, idealistic, wise, morally sensitive, and conciliatory. They go low, we go high, a wise woman said. Not sure you ever thought you'd be quoting Michelle Obama reverentially, but there you go.
I have a lot of time for Michelle Obama.
Going high when they go low did not work in 2016. What makes you think it'll work in 2020?
First, Hillary Clinton didn't always go so high, but I'm responding here to an experience I had that I found actually quite upsetting. I was at a political event in Los Angeles in the summer of 2017, and somebody came up to me. He was full of energy, passion, and I had written things. I hadn't written that before, but I'd expressed that thought, and he'd heard it, and it made him mad. And he said, "You want to beat Trump, you have to imitate Trump." And I said, "You imitate him, you won't defeat him. You'll only replace him." Because one of the major themes of this book is that the problem is not Donald Trump alone. That this kind of politics is sweeping the Western world. And by the way, it doesn't always show up in the political right. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, I think, has a lot of resemblances to Donald Trump.
In Britain.
In Britain. The Five-Star Movement in Italy, which is, I think, a left-wing movement. These are hard to categorize, but it has its origins on the left, to the extent that this map still describes anything anyway. It shows up with left-wing DNA. This is a broader challenge It will outlast Trump. And if we're going to bring back responsible politics, you can't fight fire with fire because the fire is the problem.
In which case, how do you see this rolling out? We clearly make the point in the book, but nothing seemed to work in 2016. Marco Rubio took him on.
Yeah.
Chris Christie took him on, trying to fight fire with fire. They fell apart.
Right.
Others, like Huntsman, tried to be more sane and sensible. That didn't work either.
We need to define what the problem is. And the problem is not just the personality of Donald Trump. It's not just the increasing authoritarian tendency of the Republican Party, which I chronicle, and its attitude and its attempts to restrict voting. Here's the biggest problem. And I cite in the book a survey by a man named Yasha Monk, who's got a very important book of his own coming out in April. And he's a political scientist who's done a lot of work he's German by origin, on the problems of democracy. One of his most alarming studies finds that if you ask the question, is it very important to you personally to live in a democracy? The proportion of people who say yes to that question declines by age.
Shocking.
People in their 70s with memories of World War II overwhelmingly say yes. People under 30, by large margins, only about 1/3 of them say it is very important to me personally.
They didn't live in the Cold War.
They didn't live in the Cold War. They also didn't live at a time when democracy delivered the goods. The reason our parents so cherish the democratic system is not just because they remember Nazism and fascism and communism, not just because they remember the Cold War. They also remember that these democratic systems that won World War II and won the Cold War also delivered for ordinary people in a way never seen before in the history of the world. Houses, refrigerators, cars, vacations, pensions. It was amazing. And that project of delivering for ordinary people sputtered out with the end of the Cold War and especially after the year 2000. And that's what young people are reacting to. And that's the background. So when you say, let's beat Trump with some tactic or maneuver, you're not dealing with this background fact, not just in the United States, but all across the world. And Canada's not exempt either. Canada has less of this than other places, but it's not exempt. This disaffection from the ideals of democratic systems, or better yet, liberal democracy, where a democracy that is not only about counting the votes, but also protecting the rights of minorities.
You do ask a fascinating and troubling question at the end of the book, which is, if I can recall it, is this sort of the end of a very bad time, Trump, a manifestation of the end of a very bad time, or the flip side, or not, and maybe the beginning of even more craziness? Do you have an answer to that question yet?
Well, I don't have an answer because I don't see the future, and I don't have an answer because I don't take the point of view of a spectator and predictor. I take in this book the view of a participant. The reason I wrote the book now, I begin by saying, one of my most difficult problems with the book was whether to write it now or to wait till we know the end of the story. And I wrote it now accepting the risk that I would mischaracterize or mispredict events in order to have an opportunity to shape events in a more positive direction. And this is how I can only write. This is my contribution to shaping events. But here, there are signs of hope if we can cultivate them. I see this extraordinary rise in civic engagement that has happened in the past year, epitomized by these women's marches. And what is inspiring about them is not just that they're huge, but that they are orderly. They are law-abiding. People behave not like the opponents of the society, but like its owners, like its citizens, and that's very inspiring to me. Anyone who writes in the media has seen that readers are not only reading more, but with more passion and attention. You see that an obsolete political discussion is yielding to some modern realities. On the political left, you see, I can remember, it wasn't that long ago, when people like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange were regarded as heroes by people on the political left, who didn't understand when people attack the ability of a democratic society to defend itself in cyberspace, they're not doing it because they love transparency so much. They are doing it to unlock the door so that somebody else can walk in. And we have seen who that somebody else is, and I think a lot of people who once admired those figures now know better and understand the importance of the work that is done by the FBI and the CIA and the National Security Agency and CSIS and Cheltenham in the UK and their counterparts on the continent of Europe. They are defending us just as much as the military is, because rockets and tanks are not the problems of the 21st century. Cyber subversion is. On the political right, I think you are seeing an awakening to one of the faults or one of the characteristics of the political right is life is full of casual unfairnesses. Some people get things easier than others, men generally easier than women, people of majority groups easier than people in minority groups, and people on the political right tend to shrug and say, it's just the way things are. You shouldn't be too nasty about it, but don't get too worked up. I think when you take those small cruelties and accumulate them in this figure and project them times a million where no one can miss them and you have to watch them day by day, these cruelties, they're really ugly. They're really ugly. And you can't stand for them. I think we are seeing a waking up to certain problems that got overlooked over the past decade, the problems of drug addiction, the crisis, the crisis of meaning in the lives of the 2/3 of society that is not participating in all the exciting possibilities of the era of globalization. Now, people are responding to that crisis of meaning by literally killing themselves with drugs, with guns, by not taking care of their health in ways. Trump exploited that, but he saw it at a time when other people didn't want to talk about it. He's alerted democratic societies to the destabilizing effect of immigration on a very large scale. Where you get these ultranationalist authoritarian movements is where societies are failing to cope well with mass movements of people on a scale never before seen in human history. So there are possibilities here. And the test, the challenge, not just for Americans, but for everybody in the democratic world, is to rise to them in responsible ways.
Well said. We are happy to recommend Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic. David Frum, we always appreciate your visits to our studio here back in your hometown of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Thanks so much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.